And this is not in my sermon, but it won't take long. I woke up this morning terrified. I wasn't nervous until this morning, but I had had this dream that I came up on stage tonight, and it was this podium. When it terrified me when I saw this, I thought, where's the one I can hide behind? And this podium was sitting over here, facing that way, and I came up, and you were wearing, Dan, what could only be described as a large marshmallow-looking sweater. It was white, it was fluffy, it was probably from about 83, and it was awful. And you were standing here, and the podium was here, and there was music on it. My sermon was nowhere to be found, and apparently you wanted me to either sing or lead music. And after Ann resuscitated me with the defib machine, I was ready to come preach again tonight. Now, I do want to ask this. If I say the names, Tiny, Shiny, and Don, does anyone in here recognize those names? This is a very important trio, especially if I've got some children raising their hands. I'm not going to ask for their answers. And if you don't know Tiny and Shiny and Don, then you may recognize their brothers named Buddy. Buddy, Tiny, Shiny, and Don are all siblings, and they all look a little bit alike. They have 2 legs and 2 eyes and 2 ears and kind of 2 arms. They love to ride trains. There's a hint. They love to eat fish, and they're green. Now, this isn't an alien story. They're actually pteranodons. If you know what a pteranodon is, then find a 5-year-old and he'll tell you. Pteranodons are dinosaurs, and they're on a TV show that my son loves. And we love it too, but the reason why I love it is because these 3, Tiny and Shiny Don, are pteranodons, but the 4th is actually, and I'm not real sure if this would be correct to a paleontologist, is an orange with blue polka dot Tyrannosaurus rex that looks like he's about this tall. It's a little T-Rex. And what makes this story, what makes this TV show so neat for us is that Buddy is adopted into this pteranodon family. And Buddy typically leads all these adventures, which I'm sure all children do, certainly adopted ones do. And so it's kind of neat every time Ann and I see that. Now, Zachary doesn't understand that, but it's neat to see Buddy, this adopted T-Rex. Now, most of y'all do know our story, the familiar story of us, the perpetual longing that Ann and I went through, the desire for a child, the hopes dashed month after month when pregnancy eluded us, the resignation that adoption would be the only way that we would ever have a child, and that the only way that we would ever hear the words, Mommy or Daddy. Now, many of you also remember the day that we brought Zachary home. It was a tremendous day. The absolute joy, the pain of the 3 days that we spent there in Lubbock, Texas. Seeing him moments after birth, holding him, changing his first diaper, which almost convinced me otherwise, knowing then that this is my son. This is what we have longed for. But still being afraid that somehow it wouldn't work out. Watching and riding this pendulum between joy and fear, hour after hour for 2-3 days. And during those days of waiting, loving the birth mother, we know the birth mom, loving the birth grandparents, feeling so much a part of them, and yet seeing their joy and despair, and knowing that our hopes hung on their sacrifice. For us to be blessed with a child meant for them to be broken with a loss. Their sacrifice, our redemption as parents. And then the afternoon comes when signatures and commitments place a child from a birth mother's hands to ours, from her heart to ours. The drive home, our pastor, Howie, calling from his car, and this is a great story and one that I haven't told very often, but Howie was an enormous participant, and even more than that in this ceremony. And he left moments before we did, and it had started snowing. As in if it's ever going to snow on bad timing, it would be because of Zachary. But it had started snowing right at the end of this ceremony, and Howie's a few miles ahead of us. And my phone would ring what felt like about every 10 minutes, and I'd pick up the phone. Now you've got to understand, we have picked up the golden child I mean, this is precious cargo that I'm carrying. I think the tires were new, the oil was changed, the gas was the good kind. I didn't fill up. I put the expensive gas in our Honda, and it was washed and vacuumed because somehow that would keep him safer. And we're buckled in, and I've asked Ann, "Are you buckled?" "Yes, David, I'm buckled," and all this. And my phone's ringing every 10 minutes, and it's Howie. "David, there's a slick spot up ahead. Okay, slow down." "Howie, I'm doing 30 miles per hour. I'm terrified." "Thank you. If you call again, I'm going to sleep on the side of the road in the bar ditch." There's not a whole lot of hotels between Lubbock and Amarillo. I'll find one. And we would drive, and the phone would ring, and Ann would go, "Who is it?" "It's Howie. It's Howie." She's in the back seat. "David, there's a slick spot." "Yes, Howie. Thank you. I know. There's a slick spot." And making that drive all the way back to Amarillo, I sat there in the driver's seat, and I asked a foolish question. I said, "Ann, are you going to sit up front in the back?" And I realized how dumb that was. I'm watching Ann in the back seat, and with a look on her face that can only be described as overwhelmingly blessed. Overwhelmed as she watches this 2-day-old wonder sitting next to her. And you remember those days of, it's like skin and fur with a bone in there somewhere. I mean, it's just all this, it's mush that makes noise. And we're driving back, and the entire drive home from Lubbock to Amarillo, we never turned the back seat light off. It stayed on the whole time. Now, what's funny is now we have it turned off so that when we get Zachary in and out of the car, it doesn't wake him up if he's like starting to fall asleep. His inaugural night in the car, it never turned off. Now, there's something there, but that's a different sermon. But what was interesting is with that light off is that I never saw what was behind me due to the glare in the mirror, this light shining. And you've got the 14 mirrors. You've got your mirror to see what's behind you in cars, and then you've got the mirror below that looks in the reflection of the mirror that's hung behind the baby seat. I mean, if you think objects in this mirror appear closer than they really are, then, by the time you see your child's head, it's about this big because it's reflected off all these mirrors so you can monitor your child. But I never saw the rearview mirror. I never saw what was behind us. I never saw what was in the past. What was behind me, what was in the past, was the longing, the waiting, the prayers for a child. What was ahead of me was blessing, hope, a son. And then Amarillo appears in the distance. The snow is falling. There's a massive stork in our front yard. And welcome home, Zachary Caden Watterson. Adoption. It's such a powerful moment in our lives, in any life. And really, again, all children rock the souls of their parents, and everyone here knows that. The blessing, the responsibility, the love, the grace, appearing so real and yet so fragile in that little package. But adoption really isn't a moment. It's an experience, and really it's more of a reorientation in the most fundamental way. It changes you. It changes everyone that is a part of it. I remember at some point during the adoption process, we had come back and we've met with Howie, and again, he's been involved in all of this. And for those of y'all that were here for the service, we were kind of part of a Sunday morning service when we brought Zachary forth and showed the golden child, to the congregation, and we bring him forward. And at some point during all of this, Howie asked me, he said, "Do you need anything?" And I remember answering really quickly. I said, "I don't need anything. I have a son." And I felt very selfish saying that so quickly. But I remember my greatest desire at that time, and I remember this so very clearly. My greatest desire was for the day to come when a child would look up at me and say, "Daddy." Such a simple word. But in many ways, whether you're a parent or not, this is true for all of us. Our only true need is a son, the son. Galatians 4:4-7. Turn in your Bibles to Galatians 4. Galatians 4, verses 4-7, it tells us this. It says, "But when the fullness of the time came, God sent forth his son, born of a woman, born under the law, in order that he might redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent forth the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, 'Abba, Father.' Therefore you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, then an heir through God." Abba, Father. daddy, adoption, and heir changed. In 2 Corinthians 5, Paul tells us that, therefore, if any man is in Christ, he is a new creature. The old things have passed away. Behold, new things have come. I love this passage. I love that I can be a new creature through my adoption. We become a new creature. Our adoption through Christ leaves us different from when we belonged to the world, from when we lived in the flesh. At the time of his birth, the birth mother had given Zachary this name, Carter Nash, and I've always loved it. I've always loved that name. His original birth certificate carried that name, and until the papers were signed and until we could go before the judge, that was his kind of official name. But we have always known him as Zachary Caden, the same way our God knows our name, our future. Zachary, short for Zechariah, meaning God has remembered those 16 years of prayers. And Caden, and I'm not real sure how we landed on this, Ann, Caden meaning strong-willed or battle. Caden sounded really good next to Zachary. And I don't think I looked it up because I think I would have chosen something that meant righteously compliant, or is there a name that means picks up his room every day, something like that, or doesn't hug with peanut butter and jelly on his mouth, something like that. But looking at these passages in Corinthians and Galatians, we understand that our adoption begins with a decision on the side of the parent, the decision on the side of the birth mom, a decision on the side of God. In our case, a young woman who decided to make the single most courageous decision that I know of, to place her child into someone else's arms to raise. When we worked for Gladney as house parents, and Gladney's an adoption agency, and it's a home for girls in crisis pregnancies, time and time again, we saw birth mothers make this courageous decision. Now, in our case as believers, God the Father made that decision. God gave his Son so that we would be adopted, to have us not just as his creation, but as his precious adopted sons and heirs. Any parent, and hopefully most children, can tell you that there is very little a parent won't do for their kids. We'll work ourselves to death, we'll overcommit, we'll love, we'll be patient time and time again. And some parents, sadly, even sacrifice their marriages for their children. Understanding what God chose to do for us, however, leads us into a new concept of parenting, that concept of giving up the child. Not releasing our children to do what they wish, but releasing our rights to our child so that God can maintain possession. In effect, letting go. One of the most difficult aspects of parenting, at least it is for us, is the realization that you, as the parent, will have to eventually let your child go. Just ask my mom and dad. They're sitting right over here. You won't always be able to protect. You won't always be able to listen. And there comes moments, some large and some small, when you must just let your child simply be. They have to climb onto the playset, and they have to get up there by themselves eventually, and they have to fall off and hurt themselves, and you have to help them get back up, and they have to learn that process. We have to raise them, in effect, and then pray like there is no tomorrow that they will make better decisions than we did. We know we can't be all things to our children, even though we try. We can't give all things to our children, and nor should we. And most painfully, we can't even always be there for our children. But if we can't be there all the time, and if we won't be able to provide everything they'll need, then who does? Who will? Well, God does, and God will. We have to understand that once this adoption is accepted, once we make that commitment, we no longer belong to ourselves. Not the earthly practice of adoption, but the divine one is what I'm talking about. When God adopts us, we have made a choice to have our name changed, as well as our purpose in life, to have it altered. I talked about when we would have children from 1996 to 2006. Ann and I, we didn't talk about when we would have children. We wondered if we would have children. We did the infertility drugs. We did the procedures. We prayed honestly. We prayed earnestly. We cried. We questioned God. We cried some more. And at some point along the process, we realized this truth. God brings children. God brings all things in His time, not ours. Our bodies are His, after all, so why should He not act as a sovereign God with them?